That's all right. Thank you. That's the clock. So I know what time to let you guys go. As Rick said, Jake is on vacation, and I don't know whether it's going to be a privilege or not for you to listen to me today. But it is what it is. So I'm sure you guys know what I'm about to say, or part of it anyway. I do want to tell the story. And I'm going to start, it's going to be a two-part message. I'm going to start with the factual part, and then we'll go through my spiritual journey. And I'm going to tell this from my point of view. Leslie and Eli and Ethan and Davis, they have their own story. And hopefully, someday, and many days, they will have the opportunity to tell their stories. But today, you're going to hear my story. So, let's get started. August 23rd, Friday, normal Friday. Eli and Davis have an eye appointment. We go to the eye appointment, and we were actually going to the eye appointment for Eli to see if we couldn't get a note from the doctor. His vision had improved. He no longer needed that restriction on his driver's license. We were hoping to get that restriction removed. And I told the doctor about that, and he said, "That's odd. We need to look at this." And he dilated his eyes, and sure enough found what he called a papilledema, which is a swollen optic nerve. And there are very few causes for swollen optic nerve, and he laid those causes out, and that rocked my world. So there was nothing we could do immediately. He was going to order an MRI, and they would let us know when the MRI was. So we went on to school. We took Davis to school, took Eli home. We talked for a few minutes. We prayed together. He jumped in a Jeep and went to school. And when I started digesting what had just happened an hour ago, I lost it. I broke. I was no longer in control. And if you know me, the checklist guy, check that box off and move on to the next task. I like being in control, but I was no longer in control. So I survived that day. Saturday and Sunday, I did my best to survive. Monday morning, we get a call with 3 options for MRIs. We chose the earliest one, which was Tuesday night. So Tuesday night at 8:30, we went in to Lewis Gale Hospital for an MRI. I didn't know this until actually after Eli's surgeries. When Eli was laying in the MRI, they had a mirror that he could flip down and look out the back so he wouldn't feel claustrophobic, I guess. But he said, I don't know how long it was, into the MRI, he said the tech runs out of the room and comes back in with a doctor. So Eli knew something was going on. He didn't share that with us for whatever reason. If you know Eli, he's not a big talker anyway. So anyway, they actually burned us a CD. So we get home about 11:30 Tuesday night and put the CD into the laptop, and the first image that comes up, Eli says, "That's not supposed to be there." It was that obvious that something was going on. So Wednesday morning we wake up, there's nothing we can do. We're not in control. We go about the day normally. Get Davis on the bus to school. Eli and Ethan jump in the Jeep, take off to school. It's Wednesday. You guys know I come in late on Wednesdays. I was actually on the way in. I was coming down Orange Avenue when Leslie called me. She had just heard from Dr. Ing. Said they've got a PICU room waiting on us at the hospital. We got to go get Eli. I thought, wow, that's a little abrupt. But we did. We went to the high school and basically broke the news to Eli that he had a cystic mass on his thalamus. I don't really know what any of that means, but Eli took it like a champ. He asked a couple of questions. What are they going to do about it? When are they going to do it? That was the questions he asked. So we grabbed Eli and Ethan, head home to get some clothes, and head to the hospital. Once we got to the hospital, they explained why they were in such a hurry. The mass was about the size, a little bit bigger than an egg, and it was blocking one of the ventricles that allowed the cerebrospinal fluid to flow. So it was acting as a dam, and it was building up intracranial pressure. That's what led to the swollen optic nerve and the papilledema. They said he could be talking to us 1 second and the next second be in a coma. They can very easily deal with that at the PICU. Chances are he would not survive an ambulance ride if he were at home. So that's why they wanted us at the PICU. So we settled in the PICU, and Wednesday and Thursday were kind of a blur. The neuro team came in on, was it Wednesday afternoon? Thursday morning. Thursday morning. The neuro team came in and basically said, we got to go get this. This is not good. We're going to go get it. And it was kind of matter of fact. Leslie and I had been having the conversation, do we do this here? Do we go to Duke? What do we do? And the urgency of it kind of made the decision for us. And we're thankful now that it did. We had a great team of doctors. Friday morning they came back in and reconfirmed the plan. It had changed a little bit. Originally they were going to go in right here. But Friday morning they said they're going to go in back here. Don't know why, but whatever it is, they made the right call, obviously. He's sitting right there if you guys haven't seen him. He was supposed to go in Friday morning at 7:30. They had an emergency surgery come up, and the neuro team, we found out that it was a patient with a brain bleed that just about died on the operating table. But they saved him. I didn't hear anything else. But anyway, Eli went in. In Eli's words, it was a rain delay. He didn't go in until 11:30. It was a long 5 hours. But he came back to the PICU after surgery. They wheeled him in, started running a battery of simple tests. Squeezed my fingers. He was doing all of that and doing it well. That was a big relief, but he hadn't spoken a word yet. The doctors were starting to get a little concerned. Eli, tell us your name. And he'd just shake his head no. I mean, he was out of it. He could understand, but I don't think he remembers any of it. He just would not talk. So I got down beside him, right on face to face with him. And I said, Eli, we need to hear you say your name. And pretend I'm Eli. He's laying in the bed and he goes, I don't know if he remembers that or not. He didn't want to hear anything. But the doctor was determined. So the doctor walks onto the other side of the bed and grabs his trapezius muscle and squeezes it. And Eli swings at the doctor. Took a swing at the doctor. And the doctor said, okay, I'll take that. And he turned around and walked out. Those things were God working in those moments. He was giving us that comic relief that we needed at that point. Then the neurosurgeon comes in and she says, I wasn't able to get it all. I'm not even sure how much I got of it. We're going to do an MRI and we'll see what it looks like. We may have to go back in. Saturday morning they did the MRI. She comes in about half an hour later and says, we got to go back. And wow. He came through the first surgery. Everything was working. He did eventually start talking, by the way. But now we got to go through it again. And I'm thinking, I don't know if I can handle this. And again, we had those questions. Do we do this here? Do we go to Duke? What do we do? And Eli was lucid enough. He was part of the conversation. And that's where the shirts came from. Eli said, let's just do this. I asked him last week, do you remember that? He said, part of it. He said, I just wanted it over with. Let's just do this. That again was God at work. He was working through Eli to comfort Leslie and I on making this decision. The good news is the neurosurgeon told us the pathway was still there. That was the biggest risk of doing the surgery, was getting into the center of the brain, making a path to get the tumor out. Saturday was particularly rough on me. I think Sherry nicely said it best. His rain delay turned into a doubleheader. For those of you that know baseball. But so Sunday morning, he goes back in. And he comes back to the PICU after the 4 or 5 hour surgery. The neurosurgeon comes in and she says everything went beautiful. And I forgot to tell you, the reason they weren't able to get it all on Friday was his right side motor skills quit working. He was basically paralyzed on the right side. So she stopped the surgery. But before they actually got him closed up, everything came back. One of my biggest concerns going into the Sunday operation was, is that still a risk? And she said, well, it's always a risk when you crack somebody's skull open, start playing around. She said, but because the pathway was still open, the risk was diminished by about 50%. So that was good news. So back to, where was I? Sunday, he comes back out of surgery. He's much more responsive on Sunday as he's waking up. A lot more responsive, actually. It surprised me, the difference, which was a relief to us. Everything was working. He spoke without having to be prodded. And from that point on, to me, of course, I don't deal with brain surgeries or brain injuries often. It was amazing how fast his physical responses came back. By Thursday, they were talking discharge, Thursday morning. Dr. Apfel told us on Thursday afternoon, she said, I have no medical reason to keep him in the hospital any longer. There's nothing. This was 4 days after 2 brain surgeries. And she found no medical reason to keep him in the hospital. So we went home. Thursday afternoon was exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time. We had nurses and doctors taking care of us, making decisions for us. And then all of a sudden, I walked through the front door and I'm like, oh wow, I'm in control now. I wanted control. I got control. I wanted to give it back. I don't know how to care for a brain surgery patient, but Leslie, in God's sovereignty, you should have seen her switching hat from mom to OT. It was blink of an eye. She could go from one to the other. The physical recovery has been great. Like I said, he's sitting right here today. Now, that was a physical journey. I want to take you on my spiritual journey, not Leslie's or Eli's. This one's mine. That Saturday, I told you, between brain surgeries was particularly rough on me. My brother, I think, was the first to ask me, "How are you doing?" And I told him, at the point of losing it, curling up in the fetal position on the floor, losing it, I am not near the man Abraham was. And God only asked him to climb that mountain with his son one time. He's asking me to do it twice. That was a crisis of belief for me. So, let's read that story. Stand with me if you will. Genesis 22, 1 through 4. Or 1 through 14. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey, and he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. And when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket saw a ram caught by his horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Thank you. You can be seated. Now there are some similarities and obviously some differences in that story and my story. I obviously was not called to sacrifice my son, thankfully. But there are similarities. There are also differences. And it is in those differences where I grew spiritually. And I want to share 3 of those with you today. Number 1, Abraham did not doubt God. In verse 2, God told Abraham to act. And early the next morning, Abraham got up and acted. He did exactly what God asked him to do. In verse 8, Abraham told Isaac, God will provide the lamb himself. God himself will provide the lamb. Abraham did not doubt. Why did he not doubt? God has asked him to sacrifice his only son. Why did Abraham not doubt? I believe it's because Abraham believed in the sovereignty of God. He had seen God at work in his life since he left earth many years ago. He believed in the sovereignty of God. What is sovereignty? You can look it up. Jake when he gives you a question like that. He uses Webster. I used Google. Google says supreme power and authority. In my terminology, that means there is no one higher in the chain of command. The buck stops there. God is sovereign. Abraham believed in that sovereignty, and he did not doubt God. Abraham made some mistakes along the way, but he learned from those mistakes. And through those mistakes, it increased his belief in God, his faith in God. In that moment, when I told my brother that I'm not near the man Abraham was, I doubted God. Full-on doubt. As much as I wanted not to doubt, I was doubting God. If I'm honest with myself, I was doubting God. And I believe that's why I was at the point of losing it. I did not want to doubt, yet I did doubt, and that was affecting me spiritually. And that's why on the Friday morning of the eye appointment, I ended up on the floor. That's why I was about to lose it when I was talking to my brother. But even in those moments, God was at work. In one particular moment, he was working through Leslie. She had the faith and the courage to remind me of a scene in the movie Facing the Giants. Y'all remember that scene? Or that movie? I haven't explained the scene yet. Grant, the coach, was out in what looks to me like a pecan grove with his Bible, having his quiet time. He and his wife, can't remember his wife's name now, Brooke came out to me. They were trying to have kids, and they were being very unsuccessful. And Grant asked her a very difficult and specific question. He said, if the Lord never gives us children, will you still love him? Will you still love him? Leslie reminded me of that scene. And that was another crisis of belief for me. I had to answer that question. Will I still love him? And it was at that moment that I realized that it was only by his grace that I was still standing. Every breath I drew, every step I took was by his grace alone at that point. 2 Peter 1 through 3 explains this. His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. His power has given us everything we need. That's his sovereignty at work. It is in our flesh, it is in our weakness that we doubt. That doubt comes from lack of faith. So how do we handle that? That leads us to our next point. Abraham did not question God. Now, before I go any further, I think it's okay to question God. I think it's good to question God. When we question God, we're about to learn something. You better be prepared. You're about to learn something. In this passage, Abraham did not question God. Why do we think he didn't question God? It's okay to question God. He questioned God in the previous passage. In Genesis 18, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, he questioned God. He said, God, if I can find 50 people that are righteous, will you not destroy the city? God said, sure, go find 50. And he couldn't. So he came back. He said, what if I find 45? Surely. Abraham never found the number that he threw out. All the way down to 10. God, if I find 10 people, will you spare the city? God said, sure, I will. We all know the end of the story. Abraham couldn't find 10 people. What did Abraham learn from questioning God in that story? He learned that God was right from the very beginning of the conversation. God had a plan. Abraham questioned the plan. Abraham learned that God was right. So why did Abraham not question God when God asked him to sacrifice his own son? He questioned God concerning 2 cities that Abraham barely knew anyone in. Yet he did not question God when God asked him to sacrifice his own son. He did not question God. It is my belief because he had already learned his lessons. He had learned from time after time of questioning God that God has a plan and that God is working that plan and that he needed to trust him. His experience from the first time God spoke to him in earth all the way to this point had led him not to question God. His experience had strengthened his faith because every time he had questioned God, he had seen God at work. He learned something. His faith increased. I questioned God a lot. I questioned him on the kitchen floor that Friday morning. I questioned him all day Saturday between surgeries. I questioned him throughout the whole process, really. You know, the funny thing is I knew the answer to every question I asked every time I asked it. Every time. I knew it. So why did I have to ask the question? Because my faith was weak. I had to ask the question. My faith led me to the answer right off the bat. But my faith was weak, so I had to ask the question. When we question God, it may reveal a weakness in our faith, but that's a good thing because that is ownership and acceptance of a weak faith, and it is a cry out to God to increase our faith. Abraham had done that his whole life. He no longer saw the need to question God. I'm not saying I'm at that point yet, by any means. But Abraham was, so he did not need to question God. So when you feel like questioning God, I think it's okay to question God. But be ready for an answer if you don't already know it. And accept the fact that your faith is weak in that moment. And that God will grow your faith. Paul was at that point in Philippians 1 through 12. Now I want you to know, brothers, and he's writing about his imprisonment in Rome. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Every time I asked the question, that was the answer I got. It's not my plan. It was God's plan. God was at work on me. He was at work on Leslie. He was at work on Eli and even Ethan and Davis. And I will venture to guess that he has worked on some of you through this experience. He was writing our story. He was writing a portion of your story so that we together as his church can advance the gospel. That ultimately, that is the answer to every question you ask of God. To serve his purpose. You may be able to narrow it down, boil it down to a finer answer, but ultimately it comes back to advancing the gospel. My final point. Abraham went up the mountain alone with his son. I thank Jesus every day I did not have to climb this mountain alone. Abraham was a better man than me. I couldn't have climbed that mountain alone. It would have been 2 times steeper and 10 times taller had I had to do it by myself. Deuteronomy 31:6 has been one of my go-to verses through this whole thing. And it reads, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave or forsake you." We are told countless times throughout the Bible that God will never leave or forsake us. And He won't. I get that. I felt it. I felt it often. There were times where I was at complete peace. And I can only grant that to God's presence. But there were times in my flesh where I was a complete wreck. Leslie had to deal with those times. And she did it. She was the epitome of a Christian wife and mother. You guys specifically, I'm speaking to you. You are supposed to be the leader of the house. I get that. Hopefully you never have to go through a point in your life where you can't do that. But if you do, lean on your wife. She will pick you up and she will carry you. I can speak from experience. Ethan, buddy. Ethan made me proud. He ran our house for 10 days while we were in the hospital. My parents were in. They cooked and they drove, but Ethan ran the house. Davis, buddy, he showed strength and poise that a 9-year-old should not have to worry about, and he did it. You guys, my church family, I know this is God's church, but you're my church too. The support we got from you guys was amazing. Just wow. Proverbs 17:17 says this: "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity." You guys lived that verse out in service to our family. And you did it well. And we thank you for it. It's been overwhelming. It's been humbling to see you guys do what you have done in service to us. It's been amazing. Had somebody ask me one time, how in the world can you say this has been amazing? Everything that you've been through. And I can say it's been amazing because I've seen God at work. There's 2 things that I want to do to challenge you today. Number 1 is share your story. Regardless of how little or small it is. When you see God at work, share your story. Eli, you have a story not many 17-year-olds have. I've told him this before, but in conversation between me and him, it's going to get real now. You have a story not many 17-year-olds have. God can use it, and He will use it. You just have to tell it, buddy. I know that's not your style. But God's going to challenge you. And I think you can live up to it. And I will go as far as to say this. If we call ourselves Christians If we bear the name of Jesus Christ, we have a responsibility to tell our story. He has called us to advance the gospel. We do that by telling how we have seen God at work in our own lives. And that leads to my final challenge. Look for God at work. I'm a firm believer that we go through our day-to-day lives not looking for God at work. We miss it. We're simply so caught up in what we're doing that we miss blessings that God has given us. Straight from the hand of God. And we miss it because we're not looking for it. When we miss those blessings, our stories are diminished. They're not as powerful. Our witness is not as loud. Simply because we're not looking for God at work. God is at work. As messed up as this world is, God is still working. And it is our job to see it and to go to it and to tell about it. We simply just need to look for it. Pray with me if you will. Heavenly Father, we come to you today and we just thank you and praise you. We thank you that you are still at work in this world. We thank you that you are at work in our lives. And we just ask for you to show us, to help us to see you at work. We ask for the strength and the courage to tell our stories. We ask that you use us as tools and instruments to advance your gospel. Because we know that it is only you that can provide the salvation that we need as individuals and as human beings, as a congregation, as your universal church. It is only you that can provide. We thank you for that. We thank you for using us, for letting us be a part of your gospel. We just ask for strength and courage so that we may do it well. In Jesus' holy and precious name we pray.